everyone, it's Sevi. Remember the guy who was so ready to give our character mouse to mouse without knowing who the heck we were? Well, welcome to my guide on that GigaChat Dan Heng. In this video, I'll discuss his kit and traces, Eidolons, best relic and light cone builds, team comps, plus gameplay tips on how to really maximize his damage output. Let's dive in.
My name is Dan Heng. I'm the guard on the Express.
Dan Heng is our starter Wind Hunt character whose gameplay centers around debuffing enemy speed while buffing his own speed and setting up combos that allow him to deal huge single target damage. Though he's a free character, his potential shouldn't be underestimated, as getting his Eidolons and investing in his build allows him to be a formidable carry unit that can keep up even in our current hardest content. Let's review his gameplay mechanics to help you understand how to unlock his high damage potential. Dan Heng's skill deals 4 hits of wind damage, but it has an additional effect where each critical hit has a chance to slow or reduce the target's speed by 12% for 2 turns. Slowing down enemies bumps them down the action queue, which lets Dan Heng and his teammates potentially get in more turns before the enemy does. This lets you have more turn control of the battle, and when utilized correctly, lets you deal more damage. It's fairly easy to apply this slow debuff too. Since his skill does 4 hits, that means more chances to crit. It's understandable if you have little crit rate as you start the game, but when you get to building him with ample crit rate, his skill speed debuff application will be quite reliable. Furthermore, his slow effect works in tandem with his ultimate ability. Dan Heng's ultimate costs 100 energy and deals large wind damage to a single target. However, if his ultimate targets a slowed enemy, the base damage multiplier gets increased. You really want this activated every time you use it, which means ensuring the enemy is slowed first. Fortunately, the slow effect doesn't strictly have to be from Dan Heng's own skill effect. As long as there's a slow effect, like from Welt's ability, Silverwolf's bug, and so on, those will be counted. This lets him have additional synergy with speed debuffing teammates. But another key ability to make him deal even more damage is through his talent, which is an important aspect to be mindful of. If Dan Heng is targeted by an ally's ability, his next attack gets a wind resistance penetration bonus, and after it's used, it can be triggered again after 2 turns. You can easily check the talent status and cooldown by the icon on his HUD. So what counts as a targeted ability? Well, it simply means that the ability should have the option of selecting him or the entire team upon casting it. For example, March's skill is a single target shield, while team-wide targeting abilities like Asta's ultimate will also activate his talent. However, an indirectly targeted ability will not activate his talent. For example, Bailu's skill is able to bounce between your party members, but if you target it on someone else other than Dan Heng, then even if Bailu's skill bounces to him, that will not activate his talent. Consistently and effectively activating his talent is very well worth the payoff, as the resistance penetration is such a huge boost to his damage. To demonstrate, take these 2 ultimate attacks. The only difference is that the left clip has the talent unactivated, while the right one is activated. That's a huge difference, and it clearly shows how his wind resistance penetration has a significant impact. Just remember that this wind resistance penetration effect only affects Dan Heng's own attacks. It's not the same as a resistance debuff applied on an enemy, which other allies can take advantage of. So knowing his abilities and conditions, you can probably guess the scenario that ideally combines all these things would be if you use his ultimate both on a slowed enemy and with the resistance penetration bonus activated in order to deal massive nuke damage. It's definitely satisfying when you accomplish that. Let's see examples of how we can set him up. In this first scenario, Dan Heng's talent is not yet activated, slow is not applied to the target yet, and Asta's ultimate is ready to cast. If I cast Asta's ultimate now, it will trigger his talent already, but I still want to use his skill first to apply slow on the enemy before using his ultimate. What ends up happening is his skill gets the resistance penetration buff instead of the ultimate. In a second scenario, I want to specifically buff his ultimate instead, so I'll first use his skill, which applies slow on the enemy, then cast Asta's ultimate, which activates Dan Heng's talent, then cast his ultimate, getting the full extent of his buffs and results in a juicier number. However, you should also not get too pressured or hung up to absolutely always perfectly align his resistance penetration buff with his ultimate, especially if you have to spend maybe 2 or more turns with his energy capped just to force it. That might sacrifice too much damage potential he could have dished out already. If the ally ability is an offensive buff that will affect both Dan Heng's skill and ult anyway, like Tingyun's or Bronya's abilities, then aligning his talent to his skill is still a viable option. Ultimately, how you'll set up his bonuses will vary depending on who your team consists of, but as long as you know the mechanics involved into activating Dan Heng's bonuses, you'll be able to fine-tune your rotations to make the best use of Dan Heng's abilities. Dan Heng's technique is also another way to boost his damage, since casting it gives him a huge 40% attack bonus for 3 turns at the start of the battle, which will be especially helpful in turn-limited battles. Let's also quickly go through Dan Heng's Ascension bonus abilities. His Ascension 2 ability reduces his chance of being attacked if below 50%, which helps with his survivability should he reach that point of danger. His Ascension 4 ability is the most important bonus ability, as it gives him a 50% fixed chance to increase his speed by 20% for 2 turns whenever he attacks. Since his base speed is 110, that's a 22 speed increase, which helps a lot to hit speed breakpoints. Combined with his speed debuff utility, it further helps Dan Heng get in more turns before the enemy. Then his Ascension 6 ability makes his basic attack deal 40% more damage to slowed enemies. Generally speaking, you still want to use his skill every time, even if this is unlocked already. While this won't make his basic attacks hit as hard as his skill, it at least means that if you're forced to use his basic attack, then you won't lose as much damage. And finally, his minor stat bonuses are composed of wind damage bonus, attack, and defense. He gets a surprisingly good amount of wind damage bonus, and attack is obviously important. The defense bonuses at least helps with survivability too. For his traces leveling priority, go for the ultimate first, then skill, then talent, though you'd eventually want them leveled equally since they're all important. His basic attack trace will be very low priority. Unlock his Ascension 2 since it's cheap anyway, while his Ascension 4 ability is important, so unlock that right away. The Ascension 6 ability, however, is low priority. Over time, you'll eventually collect Dan Heng's Eidolons, which have pretty good value. Let's see what they add as well. E1 gives a 12% crit rate bonus if his target has 50% HP or higher. It basically boosts his damage output and helps his slow debuff trigger more reliably. E2 reduces his talent cooldown by 1 turn, which means that he can now more often trigger the resistance penetration buff. This is his best Eidolon, simply because having more of your attacks get resistance penetration is a noticeable damage boost, whether it's for his skill or ultimate. This might also make it easier for your rotation to set up a buffed ultimate attack. E3 increases his skill and basic attack levels. E4 makes Dan Heng take his next turn immediately after his ultimate defeats an enemy. This makes him potentially more effective against multi-target content, as he can chain turns by properly timing his ultimate attack. This also synergizes with his talent and E2, as it helps count down the cooldown sooner. E5 increases his ultimate and talent levels. And finally, E6 gives his skill's slow effect an extra 8% speed reduction, which now makes it inflict a 20% speed debuff. This is another great Eidolon to further delay the enemy and potentially let teammates get in more turns before them. Now let's cover how to build Dan Heng's Relic Stats and sets, which is a straightforward affair. For the body piece, you'll generally want crit rate, but there might be a case of wanting crit damage instead if you have a lot of crit rate already from substats and light cone sources. For the feet piece, it's a choice between speed or attack percent. More speed lets Dan Heng move sooner and hit relevant speed breakpoints, while attack boosts his raw damage. Just remember to factor in his innate speed buff mechanic, the buffs his teammates provide, and any other external buffs. You might have good enough speed substat rolls too that lets you hit 120 speed innately, which is an ideal baseline. Consider the substat quality as well if you're choosing between an attack or speed piece. For the Planar sphere, wind damage bonus is the ideal choice, but attack percent can temporarily fill it in, and for the link rope, go for attack percent. For his sets, there are 3 top combos to go for. The first is the 4-piece Eagle of Twilight Line. It gives 10% wind damage bonus and advances the wearer by 25% when they cast their ultimate. This advance forward lets Dan Heng get in his turn sooner, which means attacking and recharging his energy sooner. However, farming for a good full set will be more difficult and time-consuming, so a more accessible alternative is the 2-piece Eagle plus 2-piece Musketeer set, which gives 12% attack. This allows more room to combine pieces with great substats, which helps make it competitive even against the full set. Another option is the 4-piece Musketeer for its attack and speed bonus. Since you get Musketeer pieces as rewards, it might be easier to get a good full set aside from a bit of farming in the Relic Cavern. As for the Planar Ornament set, the Space Ceiling Station for its attack bonuses is a good choice. It would be good to have enough Relic Stats to have the effect on by default, but if not, no need to sweat it. With his Ascension 4 ability speed buff, Dan Heng can reach 120 speed requirement innately, and allies can buff his speed too. Inert Salsoto is another option, as it adds crit rate and a damage bonus to Dan Heng's ultimate if his crit rate is over 50%, and this effect should ideally always be active. Next up are his best light cone options. The limited light cone in the night is generally top tier for hunt characters. It gives the highest base stats and a crit rate bonus with more buffs depending on his speed stat. His innate speed buff synergizes very nicely with its effect and makes the speed stat get more mileage. Sleep Like the Dead is the standard 5-star light cone. It gives high base stats and a crit damage bonus. If the user's base attack or skill does not crit, they get a crit rate bonus, though be mindful of its cooldown. Another 5-star light cone is Cruising in the Stellar Sea, which is purchasable from her to store by playing Simulated Universe and superimposable over time, making it quite free-to-play friendly. It gives crit rate and even more when attacking an enemy with 50% HP or less. It also buffs your attack for 2 turns by defeating an enemy, so it does require that condition to unlock its full potential. All in all, it's a great free-to-play hunt light cone. On to the 4 stars, Swordplay is a very strong 4-star light cone in single target scenarios thanks to its stacking damage bonus buff effect. This makes it quite competitive even against 5 stars, and especially when it gets more busted with super impositions. Dan Heng's skill does 4 hits, so that's an immediate 4 starting stacks against the target enemy. Only Silence Remains is the light cone featuring Dan Heng. It gives an attack bonus, and if there's only 2 or fewer enemies, an additional crit rate bonus. So focus on reducing an enemy mob down to 1 or 2 so you can maximize the light cone's full potential. Lastly, River Flows in Spring is your alternative free-to-play light cone, which can be superimposed over time from the Forgotten Hall shop. It gives speed and damage bonuses, but requires you to not get damaged to consistently maintain the buffs. It's a good option as long as you can reliably prevent Dan Heng from getting damaged, but if you want a less riskier option, stick to the other ones. Finally, let's talk about Dan Heng's team options and synergies. As your team's main damage dealer, much of his allies' purpose will be boosting his damage, whether by buffing him or debuffing enemies and ensuring he can stay comfortably alive. As such, the most popular templates for him will be either a hypercarry team consisting of Dan Heng, then 1 or 2 Harmony or Nihility teammates, plus 1 or 2 teammates that help with survival, or a dual carry team with Dan Heng and another damage dealer, plus 1 survival unit and 1 support unit. You are of course free to experiment with more team role combinations, but these will be the standard effective team templates. Dan Heng is also a skill point hungry teammate, so you want party members that have good skill point generation and management to enable Dan Heng's skill attacks, so don't comp in too many teammates that are highly skill dependent as well. Anyway, let's elaborate more on particular teammate synergies you can apply. Starting with your team survival, your preservation and abundance options are Gepard, March, Natasha, Bailu, Fire Trailblazer, and eventually Locha. March's skill, Gepard's ultimate, and targeted healing abilities all count towards activating Dan Heng's talent. However, Bailu's skill can only activate Dan Heng's talent if he was the initial target, but if he gets healed by the bounce, that will not activate the talent buff. Fire Trailblazer's shields will also not activate it. One nice synergy is by adding freeze from Gepard's or March's abilities. With Dan Heng's slow debuff, they can work together to further delay enemy turns. Next are the Harmony units. We have 3 so far, and they're all great with their unique advantages. Bronya gives multiple buffs, and her advanced forward utility goes well with Dan Heng, though it does make him even more skill point hungry. If you have Interplanetary Rendezvous, she can equip that to give Dan Heng more wind damage bonus. Asta mainly gives attack and speed, which helps in reaching the aforementioned speed breakpoints. If you're also up against fire weak enemies, bringing in Asta helps a lot with a fast breaking skill. And Tingyun is undoubtedly also amazing thanks to her buffs, and more so her energy recharging ultimate, which helps quite a lot to make spamming Dan Heng's ultimate easier. You can opt for Nihility teammates too. Welt's slow and imprisonment are so good combined with Dan Heng's speed debuffs and buffs, and again his slow debuff will be counted towards the ultimate's damage bonus effect. With Dan Heng and Welt delaying enemies a lot, that can really help you get in a lot of turns before them. Silverwolf lets you bring Dan Heng against enemies not normally weak to wind. She also has a speed debuff that Dan Heng can exploit, and her resistance and defense debuffs can really amplify Dan Heng and your entire team's damage. Pela can remove buffs on enemies, which is situationally useful for getting rid of certain troublesome buffs, and she has a multi-target defense shredding ultimate to also amplify your team's damage output. Then, if you're thinking of including a second damage dealer on the team, ideally you want someone who isn't skill point hungry or generally skill point neutral. One option is Serval, who can deal damage over time without consuming skill points too often. Another is Qingque, who can passively depend on her allies' turns for pulling tiles instead of spending skill points. Clara could also be a good option if you especially need someone to tank enemy hits while dealing a lot of damage. Since she relies more on counters for her damage and energy, she doesn't need to use up skill points as much. And as a last note about team arrangement, if you want to keep splash damage away from Dan Heng as much as possible, position him at the opposite side from teammates that have high aggro, particularly preservation units or those with taunting abilities. However, if you want to try getting more energy generation for Dan Heng, you can do the reverse and put him beside high aggro units, since splash damage will also generate energy for characters that got hit. This is of course riskier and should only be done if you have sufficient shielding or healing for it. And that's it for my guide on this fun and free character. For a starter unit, Dan Heng can certainly surprise you. He may take some strategy and setup to really shine, but the payoff can definitely feel worth it. Let me know in the comments what you think of Dan Heng and if you've built him or are thinking of building him. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!
I'll need to record today's notes in the databank.